And welcome to this edition of the Native News Update on this Monday, October 24th. I'm your host for today's program, Paul DeMain. And today we're going to go right to an interview with Robert Allen Warrior, an Osage correspondent of ours, who's going to report on a recent signing of the Osage Mineral Settlement Act. Welcome to Indian Country TV, Robert Allen Warrior. You most recently, just last week, came back from the signing of a settlement having to do with the Osage Nation. Can you tell us a little bit about what you have on your mind about that settlement, what it was for our watchers here, and some of your observations about what happened there?
You bet, Paul. So last week I was in Baltimore for another meeting, and the Osages were scheduled to sign this historic settlement with the United States government that followed after 11 years of lawsuits back and forth wrangling with the U.S. And over the summer, the U.S. came to us, came to the Osages and said that they wanted to try to settle this thing, and ended up agreeing between the two parties for a settlement of $380 million, which is the largest single settlement with an individual Native group in the United States. And so last Friday, I took the train over from Baltimore and was able to go to the interior and watch the ceremonial signing of a commemorative settlement papers.
Nothing to do or attached to the Cobell case, from my understanding, totally separate lawsuits.
I mean, I think they're joined in that the Osage Minerals Council, the Osage Tribal Council, decided 11 years ago to pursue this case, which had to do with the mishandling of the Osage mineral estate out of that same era of the Cobell settlement. And yet the Osage case was a little bit different insofar as instead of all of us being individual Indian money account holders, we also have our mineral estate held collectively as a group, which was imposed on us by the United States government in 1906 as part of the Osage Allotment Act. And in taking on the creation of our mineral estate in that way, corporatizing it as it were, creating this 2,229 shares of our mineral estate, the U.S. also took on the responsibility for being our trustee, for being the trustee for that mineral estate, and for managing it on our behalf. And the lawsuit was all about a long-standing Osage complaint about the mishandling of that mineral estate, and the settlement was a recognition by the U.S. of its mishandling of our resources.
This, unlike other reservations where you have individuals that have allotments and those individuals control the oil head rights, name different things,
right.
You're saying that there was this collective entity that was created and shares were issued. Who were those shares issued to, the allottees or the tribe?
The shares were issued to the original allottees, 2,229 of them, and ever since then, those have been passed down, mostly within Osage families. But until 1954, it was legal for non-Osages to inherit shares in the Osage mineral estate. So a large percentage of the mineral estate, including this settlement, will actually end up in non-Osage hands. In 1954, it was made illegal to pass these shares on to non-Osages. This created what some people call the Osage Reign of Terror in the 1920s, when dozens and scores of Osages were killed, in fact, to separate them from their shares, oftentimes by guardians and others who wanted to, in fact, inherit their shares in the mineral estate.
How far back did this claim then go? Is it a historic type claim? Did it only go back 20 years, 30 years, or?
The damaging part of the claim, Paul, was back to 1972. So this is all relatively recent, at least for me, being 48 years old. You know, I can remember back to 1972 when the big part of this focused on the part of the case focused on it. The settlement settled all claims going back historically, and so there's no room to go back again and to say that we want to now retry or to relitigate previous claims. This gets us up to the present and create what I think a lot of Osage observers are hoping is a new relationship between the U.S. and the government. I think by the U.S. admitting its wrongdoing here. And they did that, just to quote David Hayes, who's the Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of the Interior, who represented the U.S. At the signing on Friday. He said, "Shame on the U.S. For not upholding its sacred trust responsibility." And so I think it's very important to hear words like that at the settlement signing, to say that the U.S. was not merely getting rid of a nuisance suit, but in fact was saying that it had done wrong along the way, that it had mishandled this estate for us. And part of the promise here, and part of what's put into the settlement language, is in fact a commitment on the part of the Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and everybody else involved to do a better job, to get better accounting along the way, so that these resources are in fact not mishandled again in this same way.
Are most of those mineral rights involve gas and oil mineral rights, or are there other kind of mineral rights?
It's gas and oil. It's gas and oil, and these were pools of oil that were pretty shallow in 1896 when oil was first discovered on our reservation. At that point, by the way, the Osages had been referred to before oil was found as being among the wealthiest people in the world because of the lucrative location of our reservation, right at the confluence of various cattle trails. And so a lot of cattlemen like to bring their cattle, set it up there for a long time on our reservation. And so we had a lot of money flowing, and then oil was discovered. And then it turned out to be one of the largest pools of oil in North America. And so there was a spectacular amount of wealth that flowed through our group, through the Osages, at the beginning of the last century, up until the beginning of the Great Depression.
Was the oversight of these mineral rights, oil and gas leases by the U.S. Government, is it reflective of its deal with one particular petroleum group or entity, or were there a bunch of companies?
I think over time, it's a bunch, because it's a 1.1 million acre reservation. And the advantage that we've always had as a group has been that we can draw people into what's called the blanket. There can be a blanket lease across very large parts of the reservation, and of course have access to all those different places on our reservation lands. So companies like to come in to get a really large area and start looking around for oil and for places to find where they can get to the oil. Some of the new techniques, it's important to note for those of us who are from these energy resource tribes like ours, some of the new techniques are really demonstrating that there's still a lot of oil out there. And that they've just got to find ways to extract it and to get it out. I can speak just as an individual. I wish that all along we'd been much more mindful of the environmental impact of these techniques, going all the way back to over 100 years ago now, and the devastation that's caused in large parts of our reservation. Hopefully some of these newer techniques will not be as, in fact, damaging as some of those were before.
Right. There was a time when people were pretty careless about everything they did because they assumed that it would just kind of flow forever. And
right. And I think especially careless because of their assumptions about who we were as American Indian people, as Osages, that we were in fact not all that great of stewards for our own resources. I think a suit like this demonstrates, especially watching our leadership. I'm often critical of our leadership, but I think that seeing our leadership up there, most of them from our traditional families, from those old line Osage families from 100, 150 years ago, that they're up on the stage in the auditorium of the Interior Department in an incredibly, I thought, dignified way, speaking on behalf of the Osages to the United States government. I also have to put in a word about Hillary Tompkins, who's the first Native solicitor for the U.S. Department of the Interior, Navajo woman, very successful attorney, and I thought that she also handled these negotiations in a very impressive way. Just a quick quote from her that she said during the presentation on Friday: "We were once adversaries in the courtroom, but today we lay down our arms and celebrate together in peace." And I thought that by her evoking that sense of just how pitched a battle it had been over these 11 years, and by the invocation of the idea that there was a sort of modern war going on between the Osages and the federal government, and that we were trying to bring about peace, I have to say that as an observer of the news, I really think it's important to note moments like that when the federal government's willing to say, this is part of what marks American Indian people as different within this society. We're not merely a part of it that's being somehow incorporated, amalgamated in, but in fact, oftentimes finds ourselves adversarially defined within that relationship, and that only by recognizing the adversarial nature of the relationship are we able to get on the other side of some of these issues and strike out in new directions.
Perhaps a precedent to settling other claims as well. And what are the Osage going to do with this? Have they designated what they're going to do? Are they going to break it up and spend it in cash to people, or what do you see coming down the pike now?
This is a remarkable thing about the settlement that I think will be noted in the future about it. I think that in some of the news that comes out about it, people will remark upon the fact that in the end, the Osages decided to take this and split it up amongst the shareholders. That's a very political situation in which that decision came about, but there's not a part of this as in Cabell that's used to set aside for buying land, some of it set aside for education, some of it set aside for this. All of this money is going directly back to the Osage mineral estate shareholders, so that those of us who are in fact shareholders will be receiving everything except for what the attorneys are getting, which is a big chunk, of course, and they always take their part. For those who own a full share, which is a very unusual thing in this day and age for somebody to own a full share, although there are those people who do, there are people who own multiple shares. That comes out to $155,000 per share. Many people own 1/10% of a share. Other people own 5% of a share, 10%. And you can do the math. I mean, it's a nice infusion of money. I also have to say in that regard, though, that it's about the same amount as right now Osages are taking in over the space of about 5 years. I mean, a full share in the Osage mineral estate pays out at about $32,000 a year right now. So this is like getting a 5-year infusion of that cash, but certainly nobody's going to throw that check away, even if they think we should have waited for more. There are some people who thought that the Osages should have waited, as there were with Cabell as well.
Right, indeed. We got about a minute left in this whole thing. Is there anything you'd like to say about the use of that money? You know, Navajos, Fort Belknap, and North Dakota, other tribes. What would you like to see individual members focus on in terms of that money?
Well, I think you always want to see people focus on the long term. I've been really pleased with the Osage News, our tribal newspaper that I help run as part of the Osage Nation editorial board. Started to run articles about long-term financial planning, trying to alert people to forms of elder abuse and other forms of financial abuse that can happen in communities that see a large infusion of cash right away. Of course, I hope people are generous in their donations to things like our traditional Imloshka ceremony, where my district in Grey Horse, we've been needing a new dance arbor, the big dance arena, that's what we call it, an arbor. Need to have that refurbished, redone, rebuilt, and hopefully some of the extra cash that people have will make its way back into our community. Of course, I also hope they'll spend that money on our reservation and spend it with Osage business people. I hope some people will do things like you've done, you know, invest in businesses in our own communities, and then bring those resources, shovel them back in, funnel them back into our world.
Right. Building an economy. We got to go for today. Robert Allen Warrior, thank you very much for joining with us, and hopefully we'll get back and talk to you again soon.
Okay, thanks, Paul.
And that is another roundup of news from Indian Country on this edition of the Native News Update. Thank you for joining with us, and come back again soon.